Good afternoon. Hi, everyone. Welcome. So my name is Avinoam PATT. I'm director of the Center for the Study of Antisemitism at New York University and a professor of Holocaust Studies at NYU as well. So it's a pleasure for me to be able to chair this final session of what looks to have been a very rich 2 days of conference discussions on music, sound, and anti-Semitism. This final session is going to focus on everyday life. So what I'll do is I'm going to, you have the bios, I'll just introduce our speakers in the order that they'll be speaking, and then we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A after each paper. So our first paper will be Miriam Borden of the University of Toronto, who will be speaking on Singing the Unspeakable, Antisemitism in Ukrainian Yiddish Lullabies and Children's Songs. And then following Miriam's paper and the Q&A, we will get to hear Amanda Rupenthal-Stein of Carroll University, who will be speaking on resilience and song, anti-Semitism, and the rebirth of Jewish identity through music among the Abba Yudaya of Uganda. So Miriam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here, and it is so thrilling to be closing out the show, as it were. Thank you for sticking around. Thank you for being here for our last session. It has been so, as already been said, enriching the last couple of days. I have learned so much from you all. I have made new friends. I have new colleagues, and that is the beauty of a conference like this. Thank you to the organizers for making such a beautifully inviting space, even for interlopers like me. I am in Yiddish studies, in fact. I am no musicologist, but I aspire to be one someday. Okay, and then a couple more thanks to the Brooks Center, the Jewish Music Forum, of course, to the Center for Jewish History for hosting us. It's particularly thrilling for a Yiddishist to be presenting on Yiddish folk songs in the sort of house of Yiddish, as it were. So it's really quite a privilege and an honor. I'm excited to share some of my research with you today because I see the way that from the first panel yesterday on early music to the many discussions today, there are so many themes that are so interwoven into each of these papers and that unite these papers. Just taking today alone, I'm thinking about how do we deal with anti-Semitism today in the here and the now? What's the Jewish response to anti-Semitism? How do we help our children, our students, navigate this murky and upsetting terrain? That's some of what I'm going to deal with today in a certain way. And then my disclaimer is that I really should have titled this Anti-Semitism in 2 Ukrainian Yiddish lullabies and children's songs, because we're looking at just 2 songs today. With that said, here we go. As anyone who has spent any time around very young children can tell you, lying is a very effective tool. Imaginative play, fantasy tales, strategic misdirection, sugarcoating, all of these both expand a child's developing mind and insulate them from the harsh realities of the world. Blunt honesty is not really valued in this realm, least of all in lullabies and children's songs. But in the Yiddish repertoire, these songs are honest. They're very honest, in fact. Yiddish songs for infants and small children often take the form of personal complaints and grievances about real-world problems. They also often reflect collective discontent about the failures of Jewish society and its institutions, and warn of danger to Jewish existence. These songs are texts that are confessional, personal, revelatory, and cathartic, forming an intimate mode of discourse for admitting difficult or uncomfortable truths and for singing that which cannot be spoken aloud out of shame or danger. Today, I want to explore 2 early 20th century Yiddish songs from what is today Ukraine, 1 lullaby and 1 children's song. In very different but equally meaningful ways, both address a painful reality for Eastern European Jews, which is despite their profound embeddedness in European society, anti-Semitism remained a threat lurking just beyond their doors. In both cases, in both songs, it is the form and the maternal aesthetics of the lullaby on the one hand, and the playful and imaginative children's song on the other that allows them to do so effectively. The first song we're going to hear is called Dreyfusl mein Kind, Dreyfus my child. We've already heard today actually about the Dreyfus affair a little bit. But before we get into that, I wanted to just share a word about lullabies. In the entire corpus of Yiddish folk song, lullabies actually form the largest repertoire. It's quite remarkable. Some of these songs are about baby. Many more are about mother, the two subjectivities, main subjectivities in the lullaby. And a striking number of these songs are about mother's unhappiness, in fact. Though they appear to be private songs, they in fact speak in universal terms to a broad public, constructing what affect theorist Laurent Berlant calls an intimate public. Intimate publics come in many forms, but what makes them intimate is that they're always undergirded by complaint and disappointment. And this is because the experience of consolation and empathy generates hope that social normativity and a sense of belonging can be restored eventually. And that cohesion can be extraordinarily powerful. Though members of intimate publics are technically strangers who don't actually know one another and really share nothing in common, what they do share is a worldview and emotional knowledge they have derived from a broadly common historical experience. And they receive these common experiences through a body of shared texts mediated through the public sphere. And this is as opposed to through the private realm. And this lullaby we're going to hear is just such a text. You're going to see the lyrics, and please follow along in Yiddish or in English, whatever it pleases you, as my grandfather would say. And here we go. This folk song, just some extra audio. I also love the urban soundscape. You hear the taxis, you hear the traffic in the background. This was recorded in 1954 in New York. And the singer is the well-known folk singer Lifshe Schechter-Wiedmann. In this song, the singular maternal voice laments a collective vulnerability. The song ostensibly lulls an infant to sleep while concisely narrating the dramatic tragedy of Alfred Dreyfus, the Alsatian Jew and French army captain who at the end of 1894 was convicted of treason and sentenced to life in prison. What followed this event was more than a decade of bitter political division and public outrage over the mishandling of justice in the French criminal court system, and this profoundly affected Jews across Europe. A number of embodied transformations occur here in the lullaby. So one is that the singer becomes their mother, right? In my ears, it still rings what my mother used to sing to me, and here is the song that she would sing to me. Meantime, Dreyfus, the formidable army captain, becomes the diminutive Dreyfusl, little Dreyfus, the universal Jewish child in this song. Dreyfus is both the addressee of the song and a tragic figure made an example of by Christian Europe. On the one hand, it's the lullaby Dreyfus's mother might have sung to her infant son. On the other, this is the song of every Jewish mother watching the scandal unfold, right? Everyone knows what happened to Dreyfus, but it won't happen to you, is the meaning of the song. Even in a landscape hostile to Jews, she's singing, don't forget that you are one, right? So we have just 2 recordings, actually, of this song. It's not a song that appears in any of the canonical folk song collections. And there are reasons for this. We can get into that in the discussion afterwards if you'd like. But we only have 2 recordings of the song, both by singers from Bukovina. And that kind of geographical specificity is actually a rare privilege in the world of Yiddish folk song. Also for reasons we can get into later. We don't know exactly where a lot of Yiddish folk songs come from. We may know the general region, but we don't actually know where a song originates in many cases. At the time, Lifshe Schechter-Wiedmann heard this song on the streets of Zviniechke, Bukovina, where she was from. It was what Fred Stambrook calls the golden age of the Jews of Bukovina. This is the period of 1880 to 1914. Bukovina was at that point part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and though at this intersection of provinces and empires, Jews were politically and economically integrated and life was stable and fairly happy, the well-known Galician Ukrainian author Ivan Franko wrote in 1906 that among West Ukrainian peasants, anti-Semitism was what he described as silent, latent, in peasant huts. This type of anti-Semitism, as many of you will know, is the hardest to document. In Bukovina, Jews controlled much of the province's large-scale industry. So these are the breweries, the distilleries, the factories, sawmills, brickworks, and construction companies. And they were well represented in the trades. In a place as thoroughly integrated as this, instances of overt anti-Semitism rarely appear in official documents, and they're difficult to trace. And there's no evidence that anti-Semitism significantly hampered or interfered with Jewish life. That's not to say that Bukovinan Jews did not fear the specter of anti-Jewish discrimination, especially if it lay dormant among the peasantry. What's interesting about folk songs is that folk culture tends to preserve the undercurrents of polite public opinion and captures the embarrassing or shameful cultural and social poetics that the cultural theorist Michael Herzfeld argues so profoundly shape a community's sense of social commonality. The sense of vulnerability and trepidation that dominates this lullaby, Dreyfus soll mein Kind, which is a song that only appears in Zveniechka, which is very significant, is evidence of at least one perspective Bukovinan Jews held of their position in that society. But that, Dreyfus, was France, right? This is Austria-Hungary. What resonance does Dreyfus hold for Jews in Zveniechka or even Bukovina as a whole? Howard Lupovich reads the newspapers that cover the Dreyfus affair, and he explains that by the 1890s, Eastern European Jews had generally rejected the possibility of assimilation and saw the affair as an opportunity to critique the failure of emancipation in Western Europe. The affair also functioned as a mirror on their own societies. And Lupovich observes that while German and Hungarian Jews used the affair to express their own solidarity, in some cases with Germany and Hungary, and to celebrate their own emancipation, in Eastern Europe, the scandal was a reminder that assimilation was actually a trap. In Western Europe, a decorated Jewish army captain might have been every Jewish mother's dream. But in Zveniechka, a border town on the Dnieper River, right across from what's now Ukraine, a Jewish mother sings to her son of becoming anything but like Dreyfus. And I just want to highlight a couple of lines for you here. So in the lines, Weiß jeder ganz geht, which everyone knows too well, and nur der Fall, weil is a Yid, only because he's a Jew. In the rhyme between git and yit, git and yid, there's meant to be a bit of a rhyme there. That rhyme really points to the moral valuation at the heart of the song, right? Which is that it is good to be a Jew, in fact. You may think it's bad, because look what happened to Dreyfus, but actually it's good. So this mother's child will not be duped by the bait and switch of emancipation, right? On the contrary, he will remember that he is a Jew. Schechter-Wiedemann heard this song in her hometown of Zveniechka, a place she left in 1907, at the age of 14. And earlier I said that this song ostensibly lulls an infant to sleep because, in fact, Schechter-Wiedemann heard this lullaby from a street singer who played the barrel organ. As such, Dreyfus soll mein Kind is one of the lullabies that I call, a lullaby from beyond the cradle that argues forcefully on two fronts. First, the genre of the lullaby is tremendously generative, effective, far beyond the context of a mother's, a real mother's embrace. But still played in a soothing and maternal key, by which I mean, it's still a text that offers comfort. And secondly, it may be worth reconsidering the barrel organ and its role within the urban soundscape. If the medium is the message, it's notable that this message is mediated by the street organ, a distinctly urban piece of musical technology that was ubiquitous and notorious, actually, in the modern cities of Europe. The stereotypical organ grinder was often considered a nuisance. We've talked a lot about Jewish noise. The stereotypical organ grinder was often considered the very worst purveyor of urban noise, who was by the mid-19th century an unwelcome other. By the 19th century, a ubiquitous intruder on the sounds of the city, the more natural sounds of the city. He was also coded as a racialized, unclean, and unwelcome other. In 1850s London, John Leach, the British caricaturist and illustrator for the humorous magazine Punch, published several cartoons suggesting solutions for the problem. One of them was to send them off to fight in Crimea, ridding the city both of the cacophony of the street organ and of the undesirable foreigner who operated it. Another was, as you see here, the cold water treatment, the so-called cold water cure, sort of treating organ grinding like a pathology, a contagion. In Western Europe, the negative associations around the barrel organ and its operator were intertwined with racist conceptions of non-Anglo-Europeans who were seen to be polluting the urban soundscape just as much as they were polluting the heterogeneous ideal of respectable society. In the cities of Eastern Europe, the Kateřinka, as it's known in a variation of this word that's known in Polish, Ukrainian, and Yiddish, had a very similar reputation. The eminent Polish novelist Bolesław Prus made it the title of his 1880 short story, where it's a nuisance making an unbearable racket. And as in England, the metallic melodies of this instrument were known to be played by foreigners. In Western Europe, it's Southern Italians, and in Eastern Europe, it's Germans. And the instrument features in Russian literature of the 1840s variously as a symbol of low-class culture, an interruption of orderliness, and a disorientation of the psyche. But in all cases, impressions of the barrel organ and its player are assessments by people who did not play it, nor saw themselves as part of the class that did. Schechter Wiedmann's recollection of hearing the lullaby, Dreifelsel mein Kind, from an organ grinder in her hometown carries no negative associations, carries none of this baggage. And therefore, the meaning of the barrel organ, I want to suggest, may lie in the ear of the beholder. A London dandy hears abrasive urban noise because the barrel organ and the street musician playing it offend his own self-importance. For him, the barrel organ is noisy, it's foreign, disruptive. But among Jews, the noise of the street organ is a lullaby, transmitting guidance for navigating a hostile landscape. A Jew hearing the metallic sounds of the barrel organ doesn't hear the abrasiveness, right? Quite the opposite, she hears a lullaby. So I want to switch gears now. If Dreifelsel mein Kind is a song about the dangers of anti-Semitic non-Jewish society, the next song embraces the harmony between Jews and others. And this song is called Michalku, and this version was recorded by the Yiddish folk song collector Ruth Rubin in 1957. So here we go. Please, once again, follow along.
Kleine Michalku, Michalku, wohnt auf der langer Gas. Macht mir, was will, macht mir, was kennt. Macht mir a Pfeifele, das Pfeifele macht das Zoi. A Zoi macht das Pfeifele. Hab ich mir ein kleine Michalku, Michalku, wohnt auf der langer Gas. Macht mir, was will, macht mir, was kennt. Macht mir a Trubitzki, die Trubitzki macht das Zoi. Tu-du-du-du-du, a Zoi macht die Trubitzki. A Zoi macht das Pfeifele.
I'll stop it there. We can keep going. We can play the whole thing in a discussion if you want. So this is what's known as a cumulative song. So you might have heard just there at the end, each verse builds upon the last, and by the end, the singer is expected to sing through the entire collection of images or sounds that have been sort of collected. There are a lot of children's songs like this. So in this one, we start with the flute, and by the end, you've got like a whole band. So this entire song is marked by its unmarkedness, its lack of specificity. The singer is unnamed. We don't know. Let me go back to the, and maybe Trey, if we can kill the audio and we can only look at the text, that would be awesome. Yeah? Thank you. Okay, great. So the only part of the song that changes as the song goes on is what Michalku makes for the singer and the sound the instrument makes, right? The rest is stable throughout. So the song is very non-specific. The singer is not named. We also don't know, the long street. In the second line, the long street where Michalku lives, we don't actually know where that is. It would be impossible to map this street, unlike the previous song where we know exactly where it comes from. We have no idea where the long street is. But there are certain clues that can be, you need to use the powers of inference here. The word gas in Yiddish, the langer gas, street, indicates that the setting is urban. And we know that Michalku and the singer are very close. The self-referential mir, me, in hobich mir, it indicates the speaker's sense of personal attachment in this relationship. The name Michalku is itself derived from, it's not quite a Ukrainian name, but it's sort of a Yiddish version of a Ukrainian name. It's derived from the endearing Ukrainian vocative Mikhailuki, which is like how you would address somebody called Michalku. It's as if directly addressing somebody named Mikhailik, right? And as for Michalku, we know nothing about him except that he's a talented craftsman of musical instruments. He's what we might call a folk artist, someone Barbara Kirstenblatt Gimlet defines as being rooted in his community. As she writes, a connoisseur of eloquent talk, storytelling, wit and humor, apt metaphor, the crafted object, like a musical instrument, perhaps, fine food, the well-orchestrated celebration. In a word, she says, folk artists are connoisseurs of the arts of living. But in this song, Michalku doesn't actually speak, and the Yiddish singing is overdetermined, actually displacing Michalku's instruments and adding another layer to the folk performance here. The long street where they meet is probably the market street, the place of material exchange and cultural contact. And the necessity of that exchange in the marketplace overrides any ethnic or national divisions. It makes them more or less irrelevant. And so, although Michalku and the singer, on the one hand an artisan and the other a merchant, they're divided by class in a symbiotic pairing that also illuminates ethnic difference. Despite this, Michalku and the singer ultimately come together as the consummate folk artist, and the distance between their two strata is dramatically shortened. Here, these two urban children are partners in a dyadic relationship, a relationship that's initially theorized in the 1960s by the British pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Woods Winnicott as the infant's need to merge with, mirror, and idealize a maternal figure. And Winnicott said that this has vital importance for the development of the self. The dyad here is not baby mother, as it might be, in a lullaby, for instance, but Jew-Ukrainian, a coupling of self-identification and interdependence where one recognizes the impact and import of the other. Michalku and this Jewish singer are trading in more than instruments. Their relationship tells a story of Jews and non-Jews living in harmony in conditions of mutually beneficial cultural and social exchange. Michalku doesn't just make instruments. The remarkable thing about the song that I find so moving, so profound, is that together, he and the singer actually make Jewish music, right? They make a Yiddish folk song. And there's something else too. So on this recording we just heard, the Ukrainian Michalku, there's more displacement happening. The Ukrainian Michalku is displaced onto another non-Jewish other. And that is, and this is the album. You might see who I'm talking about. None other than the iconic American folk singer and activist Pete Seeger, who plays banjo on the record. And I think he's the one whistling too, by the way, in the song. On this record, which is again made in 1957, the Ukrainian musical collaborator has transformed into an American one. And in this sense, Rubin and Seeger reproduced the scene in the song, not as children in an idyllic imagined past, but as adults in the shadow of the post-Holocaust years, attempting both to contextualize Yiddish folk song as part of the American folk movement and to salvage and redefine the dyadic relationship between Jews, Ukrainians, and others, just over a decade since the closeness of those relationships had turned grotesquely monstrous. And it didn't only happen the years of the Holocaust, of course. We're talking about a very long and tragic, bloody, violent history of Jews in Ukrainian lands. And I just want to add, maybe to preempt some of the discussion, I'm not sure. You have to think about Yiddish folk songs together with Yiddish literature. These two are really inseparable. And literary, we have to think about literary renderings of Jewish life in Ukraine. This song is one of them, right? Modernists especially were very interested in lyrical forms that were often taken from music. They were very interested in the ballad, for example, right? And there's musicality is very important to the language of so much modernist poetry. Rhythm is very, very important. So there's a deep musicality that I'm also trying to recover through this work, in Yiddish literature more broadly. And that relationship, this is exactly why I read these two songs together, this lullaby and this folk song, this children's song, because they offer such contrasting visions of Jewish life in Ukraine, right? So to get back to Seeger's banjo is itself another replacement in the song that stands in for all of Michalku's instruments, which otherwise we just have to sing, you know. There's no banjo in the song as traditionally sung, right? This is not an instrument of Eastern Europe. But on the record, this African instrument stands in for another culture whose integration into American life was marked by a history characterized by rupture, by racial discrimination, horrific violence. So in more ways than one, this recording recovers the centrality of intercultural exchange and codependent reliance for Ashkenazi Jewish society, and maybe also for American society. And it insists that the dyadic relationship between Jew and other be reinvented for a new context. It argues for a nuanced embrace of folk culture that cannot be neatly divided along ethnic or national lines, but is rather found in the marketplace, on the Langer Gasse, on the long street. And in so doing, this song sublimates the ethnic hatred that shaped much of Jewish history in the region into a creative synergy. And there you go. Here's if you're interested in more of the relationship between Seeger and Reuben, here at the ER and his 1 year, it was a very short-lived 1-year show, 1965-66, called Rainbow Quest, and he had many, many guests. She was only one of them, but I think they're singing like Chumbala, yeah, in this one. They sing a few songs. Hejan Koya, he sings for, anyway, doesn't matter. But here you go. Okay, so to conclude, taken together, these two songs, oh, and by the way, these reels are just upstairs in YIVO, so if anybody's interested in the sound archive. So taken together, these two songs offer varying approaches to a single problem, which is Jewish difference in Eastern Europe, and particularly in Ukraine, both at the turn of the 20th century and probably long before it as well. One song warns against the caprice of Europe's embrace of Jews. The other celebrates the virtues of Jewish rootedness among non-Jewish others. Both do so through songs for and of the very young. A lullaby heard on the street in the final years of the Duchy of Bukovina indicates how Eastern European Jews relied on the form of the lullaby to constitute themselves as a public whose shared fears and anxieties were best expressed through an intimate mode of discourse. Dreifelsel Mein Kind, uses the personal voice to stage a public protest against anti-Semitism and Jewish victimization. As a lullaby, it is a protest that also already contains the soothing antidote, the maternal affect that reassures and consoles, offers empathy and consolation, and looks optimistically to a restoration of the social fabric. Michalku, on the other hand, offers a powerful meditation on the generative conditions of the marketplace, a site of cultural exchange and also collaboration, where processes of Jewish self-conception could not have occurred but for the complex scaffolding of class structure and ethnic division that characterize the market economy in Eastern European lands. As a cumulative children's song, it demands energetic performance, and it relies upon memory in order to get through the whole thing, making singing it a rather profound exercise in cultural mnemonics. Rather than shielding young children from the realities of anti-Semitism, these are songs that enfold existential Jewish danger in maternal soothing and imaginative role play. The question remains why, Shouldn't childhood, especially early childhood, be about escapism, a time to insulate children from their inevitable confrontation with life's unjust realities and incomprehensible prejudices? Why inform even the very youngest children of anti-Semitism in this way? And one answer is because Eastern European Jewish society couldn't afford not to, right? In the liner notes to Ruth Rubin's 1957 album of children's songs, she writes, and I'll just read from the second half. When we sing these songs now, it's as if we're paying a visit to the little town or village where our grandparents were born in the old country. It's as if we're playing the games the children played so long ago. And what she's doing here is she's acknowledging the transportive potential of mobilizing the intimate mode of discourse afforded by songs for and of the very young. We become acutely aware, we singing them, become acutely aware both of the joys and of the dangers awaiting us there. And so were the children who heard and sang these songs. So we assume a lullaby should soothe or a playful children's song should entertain, but this repertoire encourages us to rethink our assumptions of just how those things are achieved. In these songs, what is truly soothing and enjoyable is not actually shielding children from something like anti-Semitism, but placing at center stage the challenges, pain, and existential struggles of Jewish difference and anti-Jewish hatred, and giving children the tools to navigate them. Thanks.
Thank you, Miriam. So we have about 15 minutes for questions, and I'm sure you're eager to take questions. So I'll open it up to the audience, and I understand I'm supposed to run around with the microphone. So, yes.
Thank you so much, Miriam. This was a really interesting paper, and I think material that you know, a lot of people don't think about when they think about music and anti-Semitism. I don't have a question, but I have two comments. And the first comment pertains to directionality. So we have the music and we have the text. I'm solely speaking about the lullaby. The music is so lullaby, comforting a child, soothing, repetitive. I mean, it has all the features. It's just so standard. The text is really not.
Yeah.
So is the text really directed towards the child? Can it be at all directed towards a child who has absolutely no concept of the words and no concept of Dreyfus and will not have it for a very, very long time? Isn't that lullaby an opportunity to beat two birds with the same stone? To actually soothe the child through the music and kind of narrate a very, very important historical event to the person who sings it, thereby actually helping the mother, presumably the mother, grandmother, whoever sings the lullaby, to actually digest the story in a gentle envelope of music. So that was the first thought that I had when you presented, and I thought, what an interesting thing. Do we ever think of lullabies being two-directional? The second thing was something that I relived, because I taught L'Étranger last year, and I deeply engaged with the Affaire Dreyfus. And we had friends over from France, and I said, oh, you know, totally new territory. And they said, oh, Dreyfus, everybody is still talking about it, you know, in France. And when you spoke and when you showed the map, I had kind of a déjà vu. And I thought, this is so interesting. I had thought last fall semester about the historical reach of the Dreyfus affair. But actually, it has a geopolitical reach too, within the same kind of time. And I think packaging this within your historical context, or within the context of the origins of this lullaby, would be a very interesting thing to show what a traumatic event this was, not just for France, but actually beyond its borders. So these were the two thoughts I wanted to share with you. Sorry, no question, but I think it's hugely interesting material, and I'm so grateful that you shared it with us.
Thank you so much, Tina. I'll respond quickly before we take the next question, if that's okay. Okay, the first thing, in the literature on lullabies, not just Yiddish ones, there's not a lot. We were speaking earlier, there is not a lot on Yiddish lullabies. In fact, there's some, but not very much. In the literature on lullabies from various cultures, the lullaby is nearly always perceived as a bidirectional text, a song that is both a container for the mother's emotions, you know, a range of things. Maternal rage is one actually. You know, maternal anxiety. In Yiddish, I've talked about one lullaby today, but I mean, the majority of Yiddish lullabies are not sort of political in this way. This is a really unique one. The majority of Yiddish lullabies, either innocuously, you know, you can tell that the mother's holding her child because she's looking into the child's eyes. She's describing the child's face, so there's like a real physical closeness there. So many, a striking number of them, describe infidelity. The mother being abandoned. A very famous lullaby by Sholem Aleichem is about abandonment, desertion during the heightened period of Jewish immigration from the Russian Empire to America. There are a couple lullabies about a widowed young mother who was widowed before her child was even born. There's a number of lullabies that have to do with either infidelity or unhappy, romantic circumstances, death. There's one lullaby that is really a German lullaby about a threat. If you don't, by the way, this is a threat too. Don't forget you're a Jew. There's something rather threatening about that too, I think. But you may want to, but don't you dare forget. I think it's rather threatening. There is a lullaby that really comes from the German tradition of, if you don't stop crying, what am I going to do? I might have to throw you into a sack and leave you to the bears in the woods. That's a very, yeah. So there's that too. So in other words, lullabies actually are rarely understood as texts that are simply to soothe the infant. If they were, you would have a lot more, why have lyrics at all? Why have intelligible lyrics at all? Why not just speak in sort of the language of the infant, the pre-linguistic communicative form, the ailulu, here it's hai lila lula, these vocables, they're sung with no meaning though, they're not actual words. That would be just as effective, surely. Sort of an undulating rhythm and repetition would surely be just as effective. The fact that you have the lyrics indicate precisely what you're pointing to, which is that is this bidirectionality. I also want to add that, I already said we need to think about Yiddish folk songs in the context of Yiddish literature. We also have to talk about Yiddish literature and folk songs together with Yiddish theater. By 1890, I said that she leaves Viniechka in 1907. She hears this. The affair is 1894, so sometime between 94 and 1907 is when she hears this lullaby, or she's born in 1890, somewhere time between 1897 and 1907 is when she hears this lullaby. And by that point, from 1880, we already have Shulamis, the operetta, the Goldfaden operetta. And in that operetta gives us, if there is a canonical Yiddish lullaby, it's Rozenkatz mit Mandlin, Raisins and Almonds. 1880, we already have that lullaby. And the reason I point to that is because a few things. In the footnote to one of the earlier printed editions of the libretto, Goldfaden, there's a footnote, and he says, I only put this in here because the audience knows this song and loves it. It's very unclear what he's talking about. I only put this in here. That lullaby itself is based on another lullaby, an actual folk lullaby called Unter Jankeles Wiegele, Unter dem Kinds Wiegele, Under the Child's Cradle, which is what we call sort of a real folk lullaby, not one written for the theater. Is he talking about that one, which the Rozenkatz, the Raisins and Almonds lullaby makes direct reference to that lullaby? Or is he talking about maybe his song was already circulating outside of the theatrical context in the beer gardens and the wine cellars where a lot of these songs are performed, before sort of the birth of the modern Yiddish theater? What is he really talking about? And how are these songs, lullabies and others, circulating in these societies? It's really difficult to tease all this out, but there are very smart people working on this, people who I really depend on.
Two more questions just before we run out of time.
Yes, please.
Okay.
And yes, historical reach of Dreyfus.
Okay,
yeah,
so maybe we'll
exactly.
come back to that because there's one in the back and one here on the end of the aisle, and
Okay,
I'll take
thanks.
both of them and then let you respond.
Thanks so much for this talk. I had a question sort of about your point about intercultural exchange, and the point about Pete Seeger was really interesting. And that made me think also to sort of a follow-up about the geopolitics. Is there sort of cultural revival in Ukraine itself of these lullabies and of this culture? And also, if not or if yes, how does that relate to Ukrainian lullabies, and especially given current events and the experience of children in Ukraine today with kidnapping and murder of children? Do those lullabies have a certain cultural resonance in that space today as well?
Thank you. I hope these old songs can have new resonance all over again. I think sometimes everything old is new again in certain ways, and I wonder, in fact, about the power of these songs now. I don't have any evidence that these songs are being sung right now, or in fact that they were ever sung. The interesting thing about this one is that this also gets back to the question of the mother singing this song. The only other recording we have is of somebody who also came from Zveniechka in Bukovina, who actually says, and it's right here in the Ruth Rubin archive upstairs. She says, Chinke Asher is her name, and she says, My mother sang me the song. So she doesn't hear it from a street singer, she hears it from her mother. That, without any other evidence, that seems to indicate that in fact people were singing this song to their children. You know, the fact that it's, that at least Schechter Wiedemann gets it from a barrel organ, an organ grinder, tells me that I think the organ grinder wrote the song, is my theory. And I think anybody who was singing that song to their child actually learned it from him, because these barrel organs were mass-produced with perforations on the barrel inside, right? So these are not the tune, and she sings the same tune and the same words exactly. So I think he might have written it to fit with a song, you know, a melody he already had. So it's very difficult to trace, you know, these as sort of like functional lullabies. We tend to think of them as functional. Why else would you have a lullaby? Well, I think it's because they actually operate as social texts, in addition to, you know, social text that tells a lot more about the power of, you know, maternal affect. Thank you.
Hi. Lullabies can be also scary, because one of the famous Russian lullabies, Bayu Bayushki Bayu, the baby shouldn't lie on his side, because what will happen, and I didn't get it when I was a kid, if you lie on your side, the gray wolf will come and take you to the woods. So many lullabies had scary messages, but when you sing it with beautiful melody and with kind of soothing voice, another thing that in many Yiddish lullabies, the importance of staying a Jew. The raisins and almonds, you say, the idea also you have to remain, or the mother sings, you have to be my Kaddish, which means I have a son, you know, and you have to, in some point, say a prayer over me. But I'm talking about the song about Michalku. Michal is Michael in Yiddish. You know, my uncle was Michal. So Michalku could be a Jewish man too, sitting in the market and fixing. It shouldn't be the idea that he's somebody who is not Jewish, and he's the one. So maybe all your explanation is not connected with two cultures.
Michalku is a fascinating song. Again, another one that we don't find in any of the canonical songbooks. We only get it from Ruth Rubin. I think my theory is that she learned it from her mother. She talks a lot about her mother as a source for many of the children's songs and lullabies that she grew up knowing, which makes me think, I don't know how her mother might have known it, if indeed she did know it, but we don't see it anywhere else. It's also on in the liner notes that I showed you at the end. She has explanations, little blurbs before each song that contextualizes them. Michalku has no explanation, no blurb. So just like the song itself, it is sort of unmarked on the record. In Ruth Rubin's writings, she tells us repeatedly, Michalku is a little Ukrainian peasant boy. I don't know how she knows this. She doesn't tell us. We have to take her word for it. Maybe not. To me, what really, the fact that he lives on the long street really indicates difference to me. He doesn't live next door. They don't live near each other, from what I can tell. And I think there's something, he does something that I can't do. He makes these instruments. To me, again. I'll give it to you. I don't disagree. I find this to be a really compelling reading. I think it's also compelling to consider the relationship between Rubin and Seeger, and the fact that this song is placed explicitly within the context of the American folk revival. I think it's not an accident. So I think the song demands the reading that I offered, but I'm happy to argue.
Please join me in thanking Miriam.
Thank you so much.
And now we'll transition to another continent, yes, and Amanda's paper.
You're going to have to forgive me. I'm reading off of the tablet, which I've never tried before, but I'm going to give it a go. I want to begin by thanking the symposium's organizers for the chance to present on this important topic from what I believe will be a vastly different perspective that will broaden the discourse on anti-Semitism's influence on music making in global music Jewish communities. More generally, I hope this project contributes to the broadening discourse on experiences of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism for so-called Jews of color. My approach to this topic is complex, from an acknowledged place of privilege as a white American Jewish woman. It is also deeply personal, as I am the mother of a Black Jewish child. The Abayudaya are a century-old Jewish community in eastern Uganda, centered around the Mbale district, approximately 150 miles from the Ugandan capital of Kampala, and about 40 miles from the Kenyan border. Most Abayudaya belong to the Uganda's dominant Baganda ethnic group, and their dual identity as a small religious minority offers a distinctive framework for examining anti-religious experience that diverges from most ethnic considerations and scholarly discourse surrounding anti-Semitism. Although recognized by the Jewish Agency for Israel in 2016 as a legitimate Jewish community, given conversions that were conducted beginning in the early 2000s by the conservative movement and Masorti Olami, the Abayudaya's legal status as Jews in Israel remains unclear, and I can talk about this in the Q&A if anyone's interested. Since the late 2010s, visas for study and Aliyah applications have been denied. At the same time, anti-Semitism, in an echo of earlier decades, is on the rise in Uganda, and the Abayudaya are increasingly at risk for insults, threats, and difficulties in accessing education and employment due to their Jewish identities. Singing and music, both in Hebrew and their native Luganda, are core elements of Abayudaya identity and serve as a uniting force in communal cohesivity across the region's synagogues, of which there are 9, and schools. Today, much of the Abayudaya's liturgical repertoire consists of prayer settings and psalms written following the anti-Semitism under the reign of Ugandan dictator Idi Amin from 1971 to 1979. In this paper, I address the influences of anti-Semitism and music on the reformation of the communal identity in the post-Amin period. I argue that anti-Jewish ideologies held in Uganda before, during, and after Amin provide a unique perspective that broadens the discourse on anti-Semitism's influence on music making in lesser studied world Jewish communities. Furthermore, I discuss present-day anti-Semitism faced by the Abayudaya, highlighting the need for an expanded understanding of this important topic in music studies, Jewish studies, and in the real and lived experiences of global Jews in the modern world. This paper draws primarily on 2 research trips I took to Uganda to work with the Abayudaya in January and June of 2019. The first trip was taken in conjunction with the Cantors Assembly, the professional organization of Chazanim associated with the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism. I then returned to attend the formal celebration of the Abayudaya's 100th anniversary, a gathering of well over 2,000 Jews, Muslims, and Christians from the region, as well as Ugandan tribal leadership, government officials, American rabbinical leaders, and observers from the Jewish Agency for Israel. I have since conducted subsequent formal and informal interviews remotely. The Abayudaya identify their founder as the Bugandan warrior leader, Seme Kakungulu. Born in 1869, Kakungulu was baptized as a child or young teen by Protestant missionaries. Multiple biographies survive on Kakungulu, most recording his military victories and influence on the creation of the modern nation of Uganda. Historian of British colonialism, Michael Twaddle, observed that these accounts often present differing or even contradictory stories of Kakungulu's life, and opinions are not united in their depiction of him as, quote, a non-conforming heroic figure who turned his back on the establishment of both intertribal politics and Western influences, unquote. Notably, almost all of these early biographies discount or entirely negate the warrior chief's Judaism. Kakungulu had a complex and volatile relationship with British colonial powers in Uganda. He initially collaborated with and supported British colonial rule of the region in the 1890s and early 1900s, hoping to use the power and connections made to declare himself the Kabaka, or the king of Buganda. This had never been in the British plan, however, and in a sort of compromise, Kakungulu was instead made merely the county chief of an area directly around Mbale, which would ultimately become the center for the Abayudaya community. As a result of gradual souring relationship between the British colonialists, Kakungulu began associating with the Malaki Christian subsect that had begun to dominate the region of eastern Uganda in the 1910s. Although essentially a Protestant offshoot, the group rejected much of Western religious practice and eschewed Western medicine, including immunizations, which was of concern to the British colonial powers. Their understanding of the Bible was staunchly literal, and most distinctively, the followers observed a Saturday Sabbath. According to oral histories, as well as surviving letters from those that knew him, Seme Kakangulu shifted in religious practice again in 1919, becoming more engrossed in the literal reading of the Old Testament. In particular, he was taken with the importance of circumcision as a fundamental Mosaic law. Balmaliki leadership chastised him that this was the practice of the Jews, not the believers of the New Testament, to which he is said to have declared, if this is the case, then from this day on, I am a Jew, Muyudaya. So the word Yudaya, Yehuda, Jew. Community members told me that Kakangulu tore the New Testament from a Bible and declared his community followers of Jewish practice, but no printed records or histories repeat this specific claim. Although a foreign trader remembered simply as Yosef visited the community in the 1910s, the group flourished without much outside influence for decades, practicing what we might describe today as a modified Torah Judaism. Little is known about Yosef, though Elder Samson Mugombe from the community recalled in the 1970s that Yosef was, quote, about 40 years old, dark-skinned and bearded, and in imitation of this, Kakangulu also grew a beard. After Yosef's 6-month stay in Kakangulu, the community's practice shifted. That included rabbinic teachings, including kashrut, the addition of holidays of Hanukkah and Purim, and the observance of Bar Mitzvah. The story of ripping the New Testament from the Bible reappears with Yosef. Ethnomusicologist Jeffrey A. Summit writes, quote, according to community elders, members literally ripped the pages of the Gospels out of their Bibles. Whether it was their chief or the emerging Abayudaya themselves who had completed the symbolic act is perhaps neither here nor there. Jewish identity had become firmly entrenched by Kakangulu's death in 1928. In 1962, Israeli diplomat Aryeh Oded began visiting the community and arranging prayer books and donations to be sent from the United States and Israel. Of Yemenite Adeni ancestry, Oded was born in Jerusalem under the British Mandate. He was a member of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and was sent to Uganda to complete a doctorate at Makerere University. Oded's work in Uganda was wide-reaching and beyond his contact with the Abayudaya, and it is held as a success for early Israeli diplomacy on the African continent. Oded's writings on the Abayudaya were among the first to reach Hebrew and English-speaking audiences, and really it's like 2 very short articles that give kind of a brief glimpse of what it was like in the 60s and 70s before Amin. So it's not very extensive at all, and they were pretty hard to get my hands on. Early musics of the Abayudaya were undoubtedly heard by early travelers, such as Yosef or Aryeh Oded, but were not recorded commercially until Summit's research in the early 2000s. And this is where our papers connect, because I also have a Smithsonian Folkways album. So, Summit's recordings for the table book Abayudaya, The Jews of Uganda, edited by Richard Sobel, photographer, and Abayudaya, Music of the Jewish People, Smithsonian Folkways, 2003, were vigorously researched and received popular and critical acclaim, leading to a Grammy nomination for the latter. That is from the table book. Both of these albums included passages of the enigmatic Ha'azinu, the 53rd Parsha, or Torah reading, read annually on Shabbat morning, consisting of Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 1 through 52. The first 43 of those verses set poetically in a distinctive 2-column format. So it's one of the few passages in the Torah where you have the sort of divergence from the standard format. The other being Song of Tzvi. The Abayudaya melody for Ha'azinu, which is sung in Luganda, is generally accepted as one of the earliest and oldest surviving musical traditions dating back to the days of Seme Kakangulu. So what's really interesting about this early music of the Abayudaya is that at this period, nobody in any of the literature is talking about anti-Jewishness or anti-Semitism. They're just sort of tolerated. And everyone's like, yeah, you know, there's the Jews over in Mbale, like they're doing what they want. And so this music has this sort of, you know, it just was a part of sort of what was going on there without really thinking yet about anti-Semitism. In 1971, Idi Amin launched the military coup of Ugandan government, bringing forth a brutal dictatorship dominated by exclusionist policies. It is in this period that the Abayudaya began to experience a shift from generally being ignored or at least tacitly tolerated by their neighbors to sentiments that we would describe as anti-Semitism, and they would describe as anti-Semitism. Among other despotic practices, including torture, ethnic expulsion, military tribunals, and assassinations of suspected enemies, Amin and his government stoked tensions across religion in Uganda. Although a formal ban on religion was not decreed until 1977, throughout Amin's regime, the government tacitly prohibited any religions besides Amin's own religion of Islam, which at that point was about 5% of the population. Today it's about 14%. Catholicism, Anglicanism were a very small group of Orthodox Christianity. Judaism was never actually banned in Uganda, in part because the Abayudaya's numbers were so low and because Amin had expelled the country's roughly 500 Israeli nationals in 1972. Nonetheless, his anti-Semitism was apparent and forthright. Sort of shocking picture. Following the murder of 11 Israeli athletes by Palestinian terrorists in 1972 Munich Olympics, Amin sent a rambling telegram to Golda Meir stating, quote, "Germany was the right place, where when Hitler was the prime minister and supreme commander, he burnt over 6 million Jews because Hitler and all German people knew that Israelis are not people who are working in the interest of the people of the world." Aware of their precarious status during Amin's reign, the Abayudaya's numbers dwindled from 3,000 to roughly 300 who worshipped in secret. Rabbi Gershom Suzomu, the current spiritual leader of the Abayudaya, recalled the experience of life under Amin, framing the experience alongside the Passover narrative. As Passover nears, this is him speaking, we need to remember our traditional obligation to consider ourselves as if we were slaves in the land of Egypt. For me, at the Abayudaya community, we didn't only consider this, we have experienced slavery during the reign of Idi Amin. It was extremely difficult to function as a Jewish community. I grew up during Idi Amin's time, and we were forbidden to wear kippot or go to the synagogue or observe any of our festivals or Shabbat. Even Brit Milah, funerals, and weddings were banned. No active religious services were allowed. And this was because we were Jews, unquote. One of the complexities of understanding anti-Semitism in Uganda during the 1970s is its multi-directionality. For the Abayudaya, anti-Semitism quite literally came from all sides. Anti-Semitism was a part of the broader pattern of Amin's erratic and repressive policies, targeting perceived internal and external political dissension. Amin's anti-Semitism was ultimately opportunistic and strategic, driven by his desire to curb favor with the Islamic and Arab worlds from which he sought financial backing. Uganda's already fragile relationship with Israel deteriorated further, culminating in Amin's support of the terrorist hijackings of Air France Flight 139, which was en route from Tel Aviv to Paris in July of 1976. Although the Abayudaya were praying in secret and still not recognized by any formal Jewish organization or the Israeli government, the community profoundly felt connected to the plight of those hostages. Suzomu described how the Abayudaya connected their own plight with that of the hostages, quote, "We continue to pray in the cover of our bedrooms at night, and our prayers, including the composed section on the overthrow of Idi Amin." I don't have that anymore, unfortunately. I remember that part of our prayers had in 1976 when a successful rescue of the Jewish hostages at the Entebbe airport was conducted under the leadership of the late Yoni Netanyahu. But that was a sign that sooner or later, Amin would be defeated, unquote. At the same time, much of the on-the-ground anti-Semitism experienced by the Abayudaya during the Amin period played into a more historical tropes of Christian anti-Semitism. The primary explicit experience of anti-Semitism and claims were the claim of deicide, that the Jews were collectively responsible for the death of Jesus. In 2019, Suzomu recalled his childhood experiences. "It was extremely difficult to go to school," he spoke. "Children sung insults. They threw stones and dust and spit on us and called us Christ killers." Historian Jeremy Cohen has argued that the reaction to the crucifixion story can, quote, serve as a barometer of the social and religious climate of a society. The pressure of Christians under Amin was high, so the tiny population of Abayudaya were an easy scapegoat. The anti-Semitism, influenced by the centuries of Western and European understanding of the place of Jews, was itself colonially influenced, and a legacy of the white Catholic and Protestant society's influence on Uganda. It would take more than 3 years for Amin to be overthrown and the Abayudaya to emerge from religious hiding. Evoking the spirit of Passover, Suzomu recalled, quote, "In 1978, a war broke out between Ugandan rebels supported by a Tanzanian army, and Amin was overthrown on the 11th day of April 1979, which corresponds directly with the 14th day of the month of Nisan, on which we celebrate the departure from Egypt and freedom. During the 1980s, the community gradually re-emerged under the leadership of Suzomu and his brothers JJ Keki and Aaron Kintu Moses. Summit argues that the music composed by the young adults during this period, quote, played a central role in the community's transformation. Suzomu, who is the grandson of Rabbi Samson Mugombe, described the music of Kakungulu as low and humble, causing a lack of enthusiasm toward the style of the singing, which was considered sad songs that can't be used to praise God. In particular, Suzomu described the melodic material of Ha'azinu and other tunes from the Kakungulu era as meandering, with tone slides and irregular rhythms that were difficult to sing in group settings. It is understandable thus, given that the stylistic shift toward more accessible singing, that the Abayudaya's dwindled numbers during the time of Idi Amin's rule, that younger generations would attempt to revive the community with new and tuneful melodies. So essentially what I argue here is that this is music out of anti-Semitism, emerging from anti-Semitism. It is difficult to fully grasp what the music of the 1980s would have sounded like, as the earliest produced album of Bayudaya music was made in 1987 by Kulanu, an organization that supports isolated and returning emerging global Jewish communities. The tracks are a mixture of liturgical and paraliturgical melodies drawn both from the community's own musical traditions and influences of American Ashkenazi music practice. For example, the album opens with the Abayudaya's version of the Shema. Accompanied by guitar, the track is highly metrical with a duple meter 4/4, common in sub-Saharan music, particularly those formerly missionized or colonized communities. However, there is a flexibility of phrase structure observable in the older music, like Ha'azinu. Unlike the highly metrical and balanced phrases of Hebrew texts and psalms, such as Lecha Dodi or Adon Olam, the text for Shema and the subsequent first paragraph of Deuteronomy 6 are irregular in phrase, cadence, and number of syllables. As such, the soloist on Shema, in Shalom Everybody Everywhere, is forced to modify the text to superimpose in a more balanced hymn-like melody, even with the addition of vocalized syllables ha ha ha, ah 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 at the end of several phrases. The verse-chorus form, as you can see here, is inconsistent, with sections varying in length, equivalent roughly to 8, 12, or 16 measures to fit the texts.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Echad. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Echad. Shema, 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 Shema Yisrael. Shema, 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 Shema Yisrael. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. Behol lebo beha, bo behol nafosheha, behol maodeha, ha 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 ha. Shema, 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 Shema Yisrael. Shema, 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 Shema Yisrael. Behayu hadivan, asher Anohi misaveha. Alo lebo beha, ha 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 ha. Shema, 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 Shema Yisrael.
you get the idea. It's on YouTube. You can find it. This sort of macro flexibility of phrasing evoke the earlier Abayudaya singing style from the pre-Amin period, while they simultaneously manifest a more balanced and highly metrical, rhythmic, accessible singing style that served the community's needs after Amin. The story is, in some ways, a tale as old as time. Look at the youth culture to revive synagogue music practice, and thus Jewish life. Suzomu elaborated, quote, "We saw that Ha'azinu was not enough. Youth are interested in modern things, and it was a time that we were discouraged under the reign of Amin. We wanted music that would attract the youth back to the community." And the resulting repertoire of this reform was about 15 settings for the Psalms, composed by these younger members, both men and women. Stylistically, the community openly acknowledges the influence of Protestant church melodies from Uganda and Kenya, as well as Zulu and Bantu folk music heard increasingly available on the radios during this time. Perhaps more so than the Hebrew texted Shema, the Abayudaya psalm melodies preserve the emotional impact of the spiritual reemergence and the spiritual reform following the anti-Semitism of the Amin period. Psalm 24, which reflects on the act of creation, exemplifies the style of these psalms. I made this recording during morning services on Rosh Chodesh Adar 1, I think, displaying the maintenance of the flexible style of the Kakangula era, fused with the tonal communal singing style of the 1980 reformers. The phrasing intermittently aligns with the Lugandan translation of the psalm, highlighting moments especially where you hear the name of God or a reference to God. So the Abayudaya have adopted a practice that certain Lugandan names of God they don't use because they're too associated with Christianity, and so you'll hear Adonai occasionally. They do maintain Lubale, which is like one of the many Lord names of God, and then Kabaka, which is king. So has the text on the slides. See, like sometimes the phrasing will line up with the text, and other times it won't. It was really tricky to try to like figure out how to put those slides on there for you with the text because it was so imbalanced. But it's remarkably consistent. I had other recordings of this same psalm, and they were like consistent and sort of held in the communal memory, even as they were inconsistent by my sort of ethnomusicology hat. By the 1990s, the Abayudaya increasingly connected with Western Jewish practice through visits of American college students, Israeli young adults during gap year, and American organizations of Kulanu and Bechola Shon. Approximately 400 Abayudaya were formally converted in 2002 by members of the Rabbinical Assembly. Subsequent conversions have continued to both formalize Jewish status for descendants of the original community as well as others from the region. These are both Muslim and Christians from the region who seek to align themselves with the Abayudaya. In 2008, Suzomu was ordained as a rabbi by the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies in Los Angeles, the first native-born Western ordained rabbi of sub-Saharan Africa, and his son-in-law, Samson Nidertu, is currently a student at Ziegler. During my trips in 2019, community leaders estimated their numbers at roughly 2,000 synagogues and schools in 2,000 members, and with synagogues and schools in multiple villages. At the time, 2019, anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish sentiment seemed a thing of the past. In a primarily Muslim district, Suzomu was elected to the Ugandan parliament in 2016 as a member of the opposition party. The Hadassah Primary School, founded and funded partially by American donors, was well regarded in the region. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim students learned Hebrew, sang psalms, and other musics from the re-emergence period, even winning nationwide school choral competitions using these texts. And all boarders at the school celebrated Shabbat in some sense, regardless of their religion. Yet, there are echoes and perhaps even a growing chorus of the Amin period and anti-Semitism for the Abayudaya today. While most agree that being Jewish under Amin was far more difficult than today, Ariel observed, quote, yes and no. Yes, since there was freedom of belief, which wasn't there for our parents and grandparents, and no, because of the exposure and easy access of news and information, be it false, we are easily ganged up upon against. Rabbi Simaway, who converted to Judaism at 22 years old, told me as a child was told that, quote, the Jews killed Jesus, and that meant that they were our enemies. He then experienced the same anti-Semitism while a university student, when he was told to remove his kippah in a lecture hall because his professor, quote, did not like Jews. He told me young people fear telling their employers that they are Jewish, especially if they are outside of the area directly around Mbale. Similarly, Ariel told me that, quote, I was given a choice, either practice Judaism or keep my job. Since October 7th and the start of the Israel-Hamas war, several Abayudaya have noted a rise in anti-Semitism. Ariel lost friends, describing, quote, I was called heartless and stupid because I support the right of Israel to defend herself. I keep my kippah in my pocket and my hostage tag under my shirt. I only put them on when I'm among fellow Jews. Simaway told me, quote, I was nearing the end of my university studies in my final year and second semester, and a lecturer told me in front of the students that if he had a gun, he would have killed me because Israel was killing Hamas after the October 7th attacks. But it was my last year and second semester, and I stayed strong and completed my studies. Relatively little has been written on the experiences of anti-Semitism in sub-Saharan Africa. Most of what is available focuses on the experiences of Ashkenazi Jews as a minority within pre-statehood and apartheid South Africa. The recently published Routledge History of Anti-Semitism 2024 includes chapters, importantly so, on Sephardi and Mizrahi communities of North Africa and also on South Africa. The volume does not mention any experience of Black African Jewish communities today or historically, failing to discuss the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, the Lemba of Zimbabwe, or any emerging Jewish communities across the continent. And notably, it's in the footnotes of my actual paper here, it also fails to mention anything about the experience of African American Jews. Nothing, not in the footnotes, not in like the searches. This exclusion of Black African Jews and African American Jews from the discourse might be expected in earlier scholarship. For example, a 1987 report from the international non-government organization, the Minority Rights Group, called The Jews of Africa and Asia, in which Tudor Parfit briefly addressed Ethiopia and then included a mere 116-word paragraph on, quote, the rest of Black Africa, still focusing on the relationship between the colonial settlements of European Jews and the native Black populations. As I have shown in both the 1980s and in 2024, when these studies were compiled on the African continent, there were communities of Black Jews. The experience of the Abayudaya vividly illustrates how anti-Semitism, both historically and contemporarily, and from multiple religious perspectives, has shaped not only lived realities, but also religious expression. The transformation of musical traditions from the Kakangulu's era's complex, introspective melodies to the simpler, flexible, and linguistically accessible music of the 1980s reemergence period reflects a communal response to political persecution, marginalization, and shows how music can serve to foster intergenerational community and oppression, against oppression. Music and singing are crucial media through which the Abayudaya assert their identity. Despite growing intercultural ties within Uganda, entrenched anti-Semitism has been exacerbated by the current geopolitical climate, showing how anti-Semitism persists in diverse and overlooked contexts of the Jewish world. This persistent anti-Semitism reveals the limitations of narratives on Jewish history and diaspora, which largely exclude Black Jewish communities from scholarly and public discourse. Last week, one interviewee wrote to me on how sometimes it feels as if there's a misunderstanding on all sides. Anti-Semitism from within Uganda, but ignorance or even dismissal from the global Jewish community. He wrote, quote, "People think only Israelis or whites can be Jewish and Judaism is within the tribes. They don't think any African can be Jewish." Within music studies, Jewish studies, and beyond, I take this as a call for a broader, more inclusive understanding of anti-Semitism, one that is essential for a comprehensive history of the Jewish diasporic identities worldwide. After all, Abayudaya simply means the Jews. As one of my interlocutors pointed out to me on my very first day in Uganda, he said to me, "Actually, you are Abayudaya too. We are all Abayudaya here at this table." Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amanda. We have about 10 minutes for questions, so I'll run around and gather as many questions as I can. Yes. If it's okay with you, I'll collect a few.
Thank you, Amanda. Fantastic paper. Thank you for bringing this community into the discourse. Really, very, very grateful. There's so many questions, but I'm going to limit myself. To go back to the example of the Shema that you gave us, I'm really struck by it because as you're arguing, I think persuasively, this is a moment of musical change that's coming out of, or not this song in particular, but a musical style is changing. A liturgical musical style, notably, is changing, and it's largely a response to anti-Semitism, to persecution of the community. And we know that any musical change, especially liturgical music, is going to come with some sort of contestation. So I'm interested, I mean, in a short paper, there's, of course, not time to cover everything, but I'd love to know more about how does this kind of change happen in the synagogue, especially in this way that's going to be, as you said, largely drawing on a lot of popular music styles. We have a lot of resources about how this has happened in the North American Jewish community, but I'm interested in what that process is like. Is there contestation about the appropriate response to anti-Semitism as it's taking place in the synagogue? And then furthermore, it'd be wonderful if you can just sort of help to contextualize this music. I'm hearing 1-4-5 harmonies, guitar on beats 2 and 4 in this sort of style. How should we contextualize this, and should we be thinking about this in the broader Ugandan soundscape, or is there other musical styles that are coming in here, and how do we kind of make sense of this whole change that's happening and what's going on here?
Sure.
Two more, yeah.
Yeah, thank you again so much for this. I'm going to try to keep it very brief. I was really intrigued by what you said about the influence of Protestant liturgical music, especially given what I know in a very different context about contemporary Uganda and the influence of American evangelicals, particularly very, very hard right evangelicals, on homophobic legislation in Uganda. And I'm wondering if there is any connection present there, and or like there's so many dynamics at work here. So I guess that's my sort of like not very well formed thought, but if there's any like acknowledgement of that dynamic, particularly as it is in fact and sort of neo-imperialist dynamic, right, at work. And you pointed here towards the end towards that sort of rejection of imperialism as part of sort of African attitudes towards Jews and towards Israel. So thank you.
Thank you.
That was a great question. I had a similar question about maybe more methodological, like how you
have been teaching yourself about Ugandan music
Sure.
and sub-Saharan African music. And then also this is tiny point. I actually hadn't heard the term ethnomusicologist mentioned until this talk. So I wonder if that is meaningful. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm gonna start out by saying, and Gordon told me today that I got to be an honorary ethnomusicologist because I think Gordon is our ethnomusicologist of the room. I'm a specialist in 19th century German music. I got an opportunity to go to this. My husband is a cantor, like full disclosure. I went, because the cantors were going, and I said, I'm going too. And I invited myself on that trip. I mean, we all know this in this room, Jewish music studies is half in historical musicology and half in ethno, and we don't know where we belong, because we belong everywhere. To speak to both like Jules and Gordon's second questions about the chordal stuff and then the Protestant or the missionary stuff. So Uganda is actually more Catholic than Protestant, although those numbers are shifting as, certainly in the 70s and 80s, it was more Catholic, and I think it's still more Catholic. The numbers are so there's a lot of infighting also, and especially before Vatican II, there was a lot of infighting between the Catholics and the Protestants, and so it's messy. But the 145 thing directly, I think, comes from the church influence and the sort of like, that's very simple. But it's really interesting because one of the things when we were there, we were working in a recording studio and re-recording music, and we initially went and wanted to record new music, and Rabbi Suzomo actually wanted to re-record the old music, but re-record some of it better, or re-record it in Hebrew instead of Luganda. So that's a little bit of a shift there. But he was insistent. He said all African music is in major. And he's like, and then he would play for us, and 1, 4, 5, and then occasionally he'd throw in like a 2 chord. He's like, no, that's major 2 to us. That's also major to us. But he was like, yeah, he was very insistent that like all African music is in major, and Kofi Agawu has talked a little bit about this, and there's some other people that have like sort of looked at like that kind of preponderance for across sub-Saharan Africa major tonality. And again, yeah, it's the imperialist like legacy, but it's also been embraced, right? And the guitar, because it's cheap, and especially now that so many guitars are made in like Taiwan and China, they get to Africa pretty easily. So the guitar is actually fairly widely accessible today, and like knowledge of playing guitar, especially among the young adults who maybe go to Kampala for college and then come back and like will play some guitar. So yeah, the 1, 4, 5 thing, I don't know that I have anything on the 2, 4. I'd have to go back and really think about like how much that dominates some of the other stuff. But I mean, it's really messy because there is a lot of this American influence. And we went to one community and we wanted them to sing a melody for us that you really love, and this young, like 14-year-old kid started singing Karli Bach, and we were like, what is going on? Like, and it was because somebody had brought it to them, so it's pretty wild. Emily, to your question on sort of methodology, I leaned on a lot of people. I really acknowledge Jeffrey Summit, whose work is really the only work that's been done in this, but I welcome anything that you want to point me toward, it's been very humbling to sort of think about this, and it was a lot of conversations, and that's the magic of WhatsApp, right, is that we can continue these conversations, and I'm having trouble translating something, and I can just message someone. I think this idea of like when music is changed, and Gordon, what you're asking, there wasn't a synagogue when they were emerging, but Mugombe was still alive, Rabbi Samson was still alive, and they weren't thrilled with what the young guys were doing at first. They were like, these guys are going rogue, and they don't want to be Ubayudaya anymore, and they just want to learn pop music. And he didn't understand. So there was still a little bit of that, again, like Taylor's oldest time friction, right? That the young people are changing everything. But I think that it sort of won out as they were also trying to build the buildings, and like the young people were kind of balancing like writing this music with, you know, like rebuilding the synagogue, and which has since been rebuilt and is really wonderful. The one you saw is American monies influenced in that one. But Rabbi Samson lived to be close to 100. And according to a number of people that I talked to, like he sang Ha'azinu every morning. It was part of his morning practice. And so they all kind of remembered it. And so even though it was not, the style was sort of fading out, it was still something that a lot of, at least the generation that is like between 35 and 50 really remember. And there's some concern that the younger generation won't know that stuff, but now they're this stuff. And what's really interesting is now this stuff is becoming passé, right? Because the people that wrote this are in their 50s and their children are teenagers and becoming parents in their 20s, and you know, so now is some increasing. There are, you know, a few people that are talking about being a Bayudaya in like hip hop, and so I mean that's a sort of another project about this, like as it's sort of going on, but the cycle, which feels very familiar, is continuing to sort of loop through.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for a fascinating paper. And this has really been a terrific panel, so thank you both. Excellent. Yeah.
Dear colleagues, presenters, guests, and friends, as we draw to a close after 2 thought-provoking days here at the Center for Jewish History, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on what we have shared and the significance of our collective work. Over the past sessions, we have delved deeply into the intricate and often fraught intersections of music, sound, and anti-Semitism. Our program has taken us from songs in early modern England, through the soundscapes of the Holocaust, to the contemporary challenges posed by anti-Semitic expressions in popular music and on social media. We have heard how music as both an art and a social practice can be a vessel for both resilience and harm. Presenters have illuminated how, across history and geography, music has been used to marginalize, stereotype, and persecute. But we have also seen how music can become a space of survival, resistance, and repair. Whether through the buried songs of intern composers, the resilience of the Jewish community in Uganda that we just heard about, or the activism of Holocaust survivors who turned their voices into instruments of testimony, we've been reminded that music is as much about agency as it is about oppression. This conference has not shied away from complexity. We have engaged with difficult legacies, composers beloved for their music yet compromised by their views, expressions that carry bias and cultural narratives that continue to marginalize or distort Jewish voices. These discussions are not easy, but they're necessary. And you have all demonstrated the intellectual integrity and human empathy that such work requires. The diversity of perspectives presented here, spanning history, music studies in its broadest sense, anthropology, performance, and media studies, and more, has enriched our understanding of the complex ways in which anti-Semitism is encoded, transmitted, and sometimes challenged through music. The interdisciplinary dialogue fostered here is in itself a form of resistance, a refusal to let anti-Semitism go unexamined or unchallenged in any sphere, least of all in the cultural and artistic domains that shape our societies so profoundly. I want to express heartfelt gratitude to all of our presenters for their rigorous scholarship, and to our chairs for guiding the conversations with insight and care. Special thanks are due to my co-organizers Samantha Cooper, Gordon Dale, and Michael Levitt for their dedication, as well as to Julia Viegas for seamless administration, and to our partners, the American Society for Jewish Music, the Jewish Music Forum, and the YIVO Institute. As we move forward, let us carry with us the urgency of questions raised here. How can we, as scholars, artists, educators, and community members, continue to document, analyze, and counteract the ways in which anti-Semitism persists and evolves in music and sonic cultures? How do we ensure that the stories of resilience, creativity, and resistance are not lost, but amplified? As we move beyond these sessions, let us not leave these conversations behind. Let us take them with us into our classrooms, our writing and research, our archives, our activism. Let us continue to interrogate the structures that shape our disciplines, our repertoires, and our listening habits. And let us ensure that Jewish voices, past, present, and future, are not only preserved, but heard, respected, and celebrated. Our work does not end with the closing of this conference. The conversations we have begun here about the power of music to both harm and heal, about the responsibilities of scholarship, must continue. Thank you so much for your engagement, your questions, and your commitment, and also for your civility, which in our times is not a given. May we leave here inspired to listen more closely, to speak out more boldly, and to work together toward a world where music is a force of justice, understanding, and peace. In closing, I would like to lean on a line of a lullaby that we just heard, but I'd like to embrace it in a more affirming way. So let me put a spin on it. Fear not, little one. Do not forget who you are. May we carry that reminder forward as scholars, musicians, educators, and human beings. And thank you all until we meet again.